and it's their intrinsic
nature. This food basically robs.
Sound feasible, sound like prophecy. So now, when you look at this whole thing and you start getting into the story, when you start really reading the story, because there's a lot of different versions, a lot of revised versions, and they changed it a lot. But this is ancient story. But what do we find in this story? You find Genesis. You find the book of Genesis. You find the whole, basically the fight between God and Satan. Remember, Satan's supposed to be this dragon that fell. This dragon, the great dragon. And here you find this ancient story that I told you exists long before your Bible. As I said, you cannot find me any biblical writings that exist before this Greek mythology. They do not exist. The story is parabolized. It's trying to tell you something. Now, also in the story, you'll read that when Typhon fell down, he fell into the volcano. This is where they get your story of hell. This is where the whole God versus Satan, or God versus the dragon, the serpent, or whatever you want to call it. This is where it comes from. Now you have the flood story. You have God versus Satan. You have Saturn. This is everything tied up into this one story when you read it. So now, if you've seen my video, that's Game, the Bible and Christianity Finally Explained, as I proved to you in this video. And in the other video, Game Over, the Hebrew Israelite doctrine in the Old Testament destroyed. I showed you in both these videos how your Old Testament, your Bible, is basically from Greek mythology. And you start to find it when you start looking into Greek mythology. So now in the Gigantomachy, the story between Zeus versus Typhon, we find that, Zeus kicked the Titans from out of, heaven. He cast them out of heaven. Just like in the Bible, you find God casting the angels out of heaven. Now in Orpheism, which is an ancient Greek religion, you find that Typhon is born in Cilicia, and he is the offspring of Kronos. There you have it right there. He's the offspring of Kronos. This story is all in Greek mythology. And when you trace them, when you start doing the research, you find the same thing parabolized and switched up in the Bible. You have your book of Enoch. When you start getting into the Gigantomachy, you can find it all in there. You have your Bible stories, your whole Old Testament, all that Greek mythology you can find in there. You cannot find me any biblical writings that predate this stuff. Now, when you go to the museum in Munich, here you have the pottery of the whole Gigantomachy. You can find a whole story in pottery. The pottery, here it is right here with Zeus fighting Typhon. The story is right there. This pottery is 540 BCE. It's dated 540 BCE and further back. You have the proof of these stories. You can't find me any writings to predate this stuff that's biblical. This is where it came from. Now, obviously, all this stuff is parabolized, and it is basically hiding, what really happened. Now, when it was talking about, 1 minute he had wings, and then it says that Zeus crashed his vehicle and all kinds of stuff, it's kind of hinting to something that happened. Maybe it was some kind of war with ships. We don't know, but it is parabolized. Something happened, and the only place we can really look to figure it out is in these stories. Okay, so now let's start to bring this all together so it fits. And part 3 will really bring everything together, but it'll fit here. So now, when we go back to the ancient world, we see that people worship these serpents. There's no way around that. They worship these serpents, these shape-shifting serpents. But also, you find stories of serpent men or shape-shifting men fighting regular men. You find these stories. Now, understand, this makes more sense when you go back to the Bible, because I keep telling you, you got to read that Bible, and there's a lot more in Genesis than what it's letting on. This stuff is put here, and it fits with other things that you, like I said a long time ago in the previous video, if you don't look at everything, if you don't look at real history as well as the Bible, you won't put this stuff together. It's no way, it would have been hard for me to put this together until I started doing this research. But when you go and you look at Genesis 3:14 through 15, when it's talking about, God said, hey, you deceived the woman and this and that, so I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. Remember that. So that makes more sense now. You find these stories about shape-shifting serpents fighting men, and then you read here in the Bible where it says that, God says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed, meaning the seed of the serpent, and her seed. So enmity means, hostility, hatred. It means bad blood. And you find these sculptures, these depictions of men fighting with these shape-shifting serpents. They fight in and they battle, and you can see this. So remember, God curses the serpent on its belly. So now think about it. What serpent do you know of that doesn't already, move on its belly? It crawls on its belly. So that means the serpent in the garden had to look more like a dragon, had to look more like this with feet or something, because snakes or serpents are already on their belly. So now it's saying he put enmity between thee and a woman, between thy seed and her seed, meaning he put bad blood, meaning that they was going to clash and rumble, and that's what those stories are about. And remember, again, you find these stories before the Bible in real life, not in Bible life, but in real life. So you have this war between these shape-shifting serpents and these regular men over women, because you have these shape-shifting serpents basically raping and having sex and breeding with these women, and then you have the men fighting, the regular men fighting against these serpents, and it's a clash that's going on, and you find stories about this. So now we're going to go back to the book of Enoch and do something that I hate to do, and that's speculate. So you had this war between these reptilians and these humans fighting over women. This is what the parable is telling us. This is what these ancient stories tell us as well. It was this war, and sometime during this war or after this war, there was some kind of catastrophe where the earth was destroyed. Most of the people was wiped out. A lot of people was killed, and it was forced to go live underground, in the mountains, and something happened. But when you go to the book of Enoch, let's go to the story of Noah. Now let's say Noah was this reptilian. He was one of them. Shape-shifting reptilian. Maybe he couldn't shape-shift yet because, he was a baby. He didn't learn how to yet. But let's speculate here. Say he was a reptilian. So now, the whole parable of the Noah's Ark story is mimicking all these stories we find in the ancient world about this flood. But think about what's being said here. Let's just say, as I said, Noah is this reptilian. So you have the flood, and it wipes out everybody. Wipes out everybody, kills everybody in the Noah's Ark story. But let's just say in real life, we know some people survive. But let's just say all of the pure-blooded reptilians were killed. They was wiped out. The only people left is these shape-shifters. That's it. So, since they are not pure-blooded, the only way they can survive is within their bloodline. The only way they can survive is to procreate with each other, to stay within their bloodline. It's the only way. Now, if they were pure-blooded, then they could just go ahead and get women and, keep doing what they was doing, raping them or having sex with them and having these shapeshifters. But because they were the shapeshifters and not the pure-blooded reptilians, they can only intermarry to keep the bloodline alive. This is all going to make a lot of sense as we go on. So you start reading about the stories of how these reptilians used to live underground because it allowed them to live longer, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So they started to live underground, and after this catastrophe happened, after whatever happened, the flood or the fire, you had people coming out and again reestablishing and rebuilding and starting to rebuild what was lost, the now ancestors of the people who first went in. So then you have these reptilians sit and wait for something to happen, something that they maybe knew was going to happen or something that they were surprised took place. You had the Nubians come up from Nubia and started building pyramids in Egypt. They started building what was of old, what used to be. Now the question you have to ask yourself is this: is pyramids all over the world? Now we know the ancient Egyptians did not build all those pyramids everywhere. It's pyramids all over the place. So the thing is, how did they get the knowledge to build the pyramids in ancient Egypt? And the thing is, they remembered. They remembered who they were. And this is one of the key parts you got to understand. They remember who they were. See, the ancient Egyptians wasn't just worshiping their ancestors. They were the ancestors, and they remembered who they were. When you look at the progression of the pyramids, I mean, how do you go from the bent pyramid of Sneferu, and you go from the pyramid of Unas that has collapsed and other pyramids that has collapsed? Now, people say they collapsed because of earthquakes, but we know the Great Pyramids are still standing. You know, the Pyramid of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Look at the Step Pyramid of Djoser. I mean, look at these pyramids. It shows the progression of pyramids from Unas all the way up to the Great Pyramid. So it shows that they were remembering how to do what they used to do, and they finally figured it out and got it right. And we know the Great Pyramid of Khufu was covered in limestone, and that it supposedly generated energy. So these reptilian beings, seeing that these black people, these Egyptians, begin to remember who they are, and they begin to build these pyramids, and they begin to get this information and knowledge that these reptilians needed for a particular reason. So understand, it is because of our melanin that we are able to remember who we are. And maybe these reptilian beings understood this and knew that we would eventually have this knowledge and that they needed it, or that they stumbled upon it by surprise. We don't know. But this explains why we see in history, it seems like the white man just came out of nowhere and started conquering shit all over. It's like they just came out of nowhere. It was like all of a sudden you had these civilizations that was doing good, trading with each other, then all of a sudden there was this war. And it's, you know, when you look at it, it's the white man in each case. So when you look at, you know, the Egyptians began to remember, and they started to, you know, build the pyramids, and they had this ancient knowledge. These reptilian beings wanted this knowledge for whatever reason. Remember, the Egyptian knowledge was of spirituality. It was a spiritual knowledge. Maybe they wanted the information so they can bring back the people who they lost, the old ones, or what have you. Maybe this is the reason why they wanted it. But now understand, you have all of these Greek people, you have these Romans coming into Egypt and getting this knowledge. Now, the Egyptians must have remembered that this information could be dangerous in the wrong hands. So they did not tell the Greeks and the Romans everything. Remember, they had their own little secret society where they kept certain knowledge. This is where Freemasonry comes from. It comes from that hidden information. So they obviously did not want to give that information to the Greeks and to the Romans. So this is why they had to be conquered. But we know, when we look at Heraclion, we know that the Egyptians was teaching people and it was trading with everybody. So everything at one point was fine until the Persians came and invaded. Now, the whole thing with the Persians invading Egypt was something that, you know, was on my mind for a minute. I tried to figure out what was that about. You know, how did they come in there and, you know, just take over Kemet? And the thing is, Herodotus basically gives us the answer to that when you read Herodotus' writings. So now it says here, the people of Argos and the Persians share the same lineage. It's saying that the Greeks and the Persians are of the same lineage. This is from Herodotus, Book 7, Polymena. It says, such is the account which is given of these matters by the Argives themselves, the Argives of the people of Argos. There is another story which is told generally through Greece of a different tenure. Xerxes, it is said, before he set forth on his expedition against Greece, sent a herald to Argos, who on his arrival spoke as follows. Men of Argos, King Xerxes speaks thus to you. We Persians deem that the Perseus from whom we descend was the child of Perseus, the son of Danae, and of Andromeda, the daughter of Cepheus. Hereby it would seem that we come of your stock and lineage. Now, Andromeda and Cepheus are both constellations, as you know. We know Perseus is a Greek god, the one who cut off the head of Medusa, you know, the snake, the head of snakes. But it says, so then it neither benefits us to make war upon those from whom we spring, nor can it be right for you to fight on behalf of others against us. This is referring to them fighting on behalf of the Egyptians against the Persians. Your place is to keep quiet and hold yourself aloft, only yet matters proceed as I wish, and there is no people whom I shall have a higher esteem than you. Now, when you go down here, it's talking about Alexander being of the lineage of Argos, so basically it's saying these people are of the same lineage. I'm not going to read the Alexander part. You can pause and read it. I'm strapped for time now. I'm going to continue. So, it's saying that the Persians, now let's just think about it this way. We know history is written by the conquerors, not the conquered. So let's just say maybe the Persians invading Egypt was all set up. They was like, you got to remember that you have Greeks living in ancient Egypt. They was living there with the Egyptians. Remember, they had to know the Egyptian language. Herodotus attests to this. They knew the language. So since the Greeks and Egyptians was getting along, maybe at some point you have Alexander the Greek going into Persia and getting the Persians to invade Egypt, because he probably gave them all the information since the Greeks was in there, because it would have looked bad if the Greeks invaded Egypt, since they're supposed to be cool. So now when you see the Persians invaded Egypt and then the Greeks defeated the Persians, so now when you read the story, it's basically saying that Alexander was supposedly not even there when his army defeated Darius III in Egypt. They said that Alexander wasn't even there. Well, maybe the Persians just handed over, Egypt to the Greeks on a silver platter. We don't know. That whole thing is weird and suspect of what happened there. And remember, it says that they was easily defeated the Greeks. The whole thing could have been a setup. Now you got to remember, these men who was following Alexander and following these rulers, they probably had no clue, one, that Alexander was possibly a reptilian or a shapeshifter. They probably didn't have a clue of this. Now, I say this because it would be a big risk for them to breed a whole reptilian army, because if one person get killed or shapeshifts in the presence of these other people, then everybody is going to kill all the shapeshifters. So remember, as I said, it seems like the white race just came out of nowhere and started conquering shit. So at some point we know that this royal family, now understand, these reptilians had knowledge already. They understood how things are. Now let's go back into the book of Enoch, where it's saying that the angels came down and basically taught man how to make weapons and how to make armor. Remember, these reptilians had knowledge already. They already had the knowledge of war. They knew how to make swords. They knew how to make weapons. They came out and they taught man. This explains why Alexander the Great was able to conquer so much of the world, while people like Caesar was able to conquer so much, because they had this knowledge of weaponry. They had this knowledge of war already. They knew how to forge weapons and make armor. So they was able to conquer so much because other people had no clue. They had no chance against this knowledge that these people possess. So when they came into Kemet and seen what the Egyptians built, they had to get it. He had to get it, and they came in and they eventually conquered it, and they got the information. So now, when you see in history, we find this whole stories of the albino wars. You have wars with these white people versus, so many different civilizations. We know about the Huns supposedly kicking the albinos out of China, kicking them out, and they went to England, and basically this is when they took over Europe. Now, you find stories of them having to intermarry with a lot of these civilizations for peace. So when you look at the Asian race, we look at Chinese people, we can see that they are light. They are almost white skin like white people, because so many albinos and white people interbred in the Chinese culture. And you can see this. You can see why the San people in South Africa, remember I showed you that in the previous video, how they look like Chinese people, but with darker skin. This is where Chinese people come from. But when you had this mix of the albinos and them, or the white people in them, you can see why Chinese people became so light. They look real light to this day. And in Thailand and China and Japan, it's promoted to have white skin. They look down on dark skinned Asian people. So now, the whole thing is this, and I know this is a question that a lot of people probably have been asking, is, if these reptilians were so bad, if they are evil, why were the ancient Egyptians worshiping them? Why does it seem like we find it everywhere in Egyptian culture? and throughout all these cultures. Now, the whole thing is this. Now, remember I was showing you Wadjet. Now, Wadjet, another name for Wadjet is the green one. They call her the green one. They also call her the eye of the moon. This is where you get the eye of Ra and the eye of Horus. It was first the eye of the moon. It was Wadjet. This is where it comes from.